Uppity Unicorn here. I want to thank you so much for joining me. We are here again in the third chapter of the last year of Malcolm X, The Evolution of a Revolutionary, written by George Breitman. So this chapter 3 is about 18 pages. I'm expecting this live stream to be under an hour. So here we are, and chapter 3 is called Radicalism. After the split with the Black Muslims, Malcolm noted, largely the American white man's press refused to convey that I was now attempting to teach Negroes a new direction. One of the major troubles that I was having in building the organization that I wanted, an all-Black organization whose ultimate objective was to help create a society where, in which there could exist honest white-Black brotherhood, was that my earlier public image, my old so-called quote-unquote Black Muslim image, kept blocking me. I was trying to gradually reshape that image. I was trying to turn a corner into a new regard by the public, especially Negroes. Alex Haley relates that the last time he saw Malcolm alive, early in January 1965, he said this. He talked about the pressures on him everywhere he turned and about the frustrations among them that no one wanted to accept anything relating to him except my old hate and violence image. He said the so-called moderate civil rights organizations avoided him as too militant, and the so-called militants avoided him as too moderate. They won't let me turn the corner, he once exclaimed. I'm caught in a trap. Why did the press refuse to convey Malcolm's new direction? Why didn't the moderate Negro leaders welcome it? The answer cannot be found in the introduction of the autobiography by M.S. Handler, whose objective reporting of Malcolm's activities in the New York Times had won Malcolm's respect. At the end of Malcolm's life, according to Handler, he no longer inveighed against the United States, but against a segment of the United States represented by overt white supremacists in the South and covert white supremacists in the North. If that was all, then why didn't the press and the Negro leadership accept him as a convert to their viewpoint and make use of him accordingly? The truth is that they understood, and the ultra-left so-called militants did not, that the corner Malcolm wanted to turn was to the left, not to the right. They believed that the new Malcolm could pose a greater threat to the status quo than the Black Muslim Malcolm, and this they were correct. Though he did not describe himself that way, Malcolm was a radical both before and after leaving the Black Muslims. After, he was a revolutionary, increasingly anti-capitalist and pro-socialist, as well as anti-imperialist. These labels fitted, even though he did not apply them to himself. As a teenager, shortly after he came to Harlem early in World War II, Malcolm once attended a rent-raising party where canvassers tried to sell the Communist Party's Daily Worker, but it made little impression on him. This seems to have been the only kind of contact he had with radicals before he joined the Black Muslims. I beg your pardon for my phone. By the time he became an auto worker in Detroit after his release from prison, McCarthyism was in full swing, and radicals of all varieties were on the defensive or in retreat. But by then, he was already a Black Muslim and wouldn't have paid them any attention anyway. In joining the Black Muslims, Malcolm believed that he was dedicating himself to a struggle to the end against white racist society. Wow, I don't like the way that sentence was constructed. Anyhow, even though this struggle took a predominantly abstentionist form and was in the beginning completely non-political for Malcolm, it represented a conscious rejection of American society and values. The correct name for that kind of commitment is radical, despite the failure of most radical organizations to understand this. Many of Elijah Muhammad's ministers, their attention turned inward to their organization and away from the society outside, remained oblivious of politics, conservative, liberal, or radical. For a man with Malcolm's thirst for knowledge, this was not possible. Besides, as he became Elijah Muhammad's chief spokesman to the outside world, he had to learn something about the views of contending movements and ideologies, if only to be able to counter their arguments. What he learned about such organizations as the Communist Party and the Socialist Party did not make him friendly. Both were hostile to the Black Muslims and repeated slanders against them. Both were blind to the progressive aspects of Black nationalism, which, like the liberals, they equated with racism in reverse. Both were uncritical supporters of the Martin Luther King Jr. type of leadership, and both advocated that Negroes should unite with their lesser evil enemies in the Democratic Party, coalition politics. To Malcolm, their policies were indistinguishable from those of the liberals who instructed Negroes that, as a minority, they had to confine their struggle within a framework acceptable to the liberals. If that was socialism, Malcolm, of course, wanted no part of it. One exception was Malcolm's attitude to the Militant, the weekly newspaper expressing the views of the Socialist Workers' Party. While he was still a Black Muslim, Malcolm used to buy this paper when it was sold outside meetings where he spoke. Even at that time, he said after the split, he used to tell Negroes it was a good paper and they ought to read it. Initially, he was attracted to the Militant because it sought, and that is the name of a publication, okay? The Militant is a publication. Initially, he was attracted to the Militant because it sought to explain the Black Muslims and Black nationalism and defended them against reactionary distortion and attack. He was drawn closer when he saw that, unlike most radical publications, it did not try to convince Black people to subordinate their struggle to the government, the Democratic Party, the labor movement, or anything else. As a Black Muslim, Malcolm was prohibited from having any relations, formal or informal, with radical organizations containing white members. When the split occurred, there was a curiosity naturally about the attitude he would take to such organizations. William Worthy, who was present at the March 12, 1964 press conference where Malcolm declared his independence from the Black Muslims, reported, and in exchange with a British reporter, Malcolm refused to rule out acceptance of possible communist support. He resorted to one of his familiar parable-type responses to avoid a direct yes or no. Let me tell you a little story, Malcolm began. It's like me being in a wolf's den. The wolf sees someone on the outside who is interested in freeing me from the den. The wolf doesn't like that person on the outside, but I don't care who opens that door and lets me out. Then your answer is yes, said the person. No, replied Malcolm, grinning. I'm talking about a wolf. I'm sorry. It's because I've got the book in my hand. I'm really enjoying Malcolm's responses. It's like I can hear him. SubhanAllah. Anyhow, 1 week later, Malcolm was interviewed by A.B. Spellman, the young poet and jazz critic. Spellman and Malcolm have a dialogue here, and I'm going to read their names as I read their dialogue. Spellman, do you intend to collaborate with such other groups as labor unions or socialist groups or any other groups? Malcolm asks. We will work with anybody who is sincerely interested in eliminating injustices that Negroes suffer at the hands of Uncle Sam. Spellman, what is your evaluation of the civil rights movement at this point? Malcolm asks. It has run it's at the end of its leash, Spellman says. What groups do you consider most promising? Malcolm, I know of no group that is promising unless it's radical. If it's not radical, it is in no way involved effectively in the present struggle. That's the end of that dialogue. Not long after, around the end of March, Malcolm was interviewed by Carlos E. Russell, a member of the editorial board of Liberator. So Liberator is a publication, okay? So Carlos E. Russell says, speaking of socialism, oh no, this is a quote by Malcolm, excuse me. I think so. Okay, I got that. Speaking of socialism, I said, with cybernetics and automation, last year over 200,000 people were left without jobs. How come neither you nor any of the other leaders ever use the term socialism as an alternative? Malcolm replied to this question, why speak of it? If you want someone to drink from a bottle, you never put the skull and crossbones on the label, for they won't drink. The same is true here. End quote. On April 8th, Malcolm spoke on the Black Revolution at the Militant Labor Forum in New York. This was the first of 3 speeches he gave under the auspices of the Militant Labor Forum in the last year of his life, and the beginning of an increasingly friendly relationship with American revolutionary socialists. But Malcolm's interest in socialism was not stimulated primarily by Americans. It came to him mainly from abroad. So I want to read to you really quickly the footnote that is here with April 8th and Malcolm speaking on the Black Revolution. So he says, the footnote says here, James Farmer's account of this relationship contains almost as many errors as words. He says, after he left the Muslims, Malcolm cast this way and that for a stance. For a while, he was strongly influenced by the Trotskyite Socialist Workers' Party, which today hopes to prod Black nationalism into violently revolutionary action. But when he traveled to the Middle East in the fall of 1964, he seemed to be casting about for some way to join the civil rights movement. I have come to this holy city to worship, he wrote to me from Mecca. In all my years in the United States, I have never witnessed the brotherhood of man working as it does here. I've witnessed thousands of pilgrims of all colors. He underlined all colors. Farmer is casting about here for some way to make Malcolm appear erratic and inconsistent. The truth is that he wanted to join the civil rights movement, that is, enter the active struggle, at the time of the split in March and before then, not in the fall, as Farmer asserts. This was one of the major reasons for the split. If Farmer would have bothered to look at Malcolm's postcard from Mecca, he could see that it was sent in the spring, not the fall. Farmer is similarly misleading when he tries to make it seem that Malcolm's friendly relations with the Socialist Workers' Party lasted only, quote unquote, for a while. These relations continued throughout Malcolm's last year and were closer at the end than at the beginning. So now back to the main reading, and out of the footnotes we're reading, it says, on April 13th, he left for Mecca and Africa, where he spent around 5 weeks. The Mecca experience is rather fully reported in the autobiography. The African account there is briefer. He kept a diary and was thinking of using this material for another book. From subsequent statements, it is plain that his discussions with various people in Africa on this trip and on the longer one made later in the year had as big an impact on his political thinking as his experiences in Mecca had on his ideas about race and racism. This is one of the important points that Truman Nelson misses in his sympathetic review of the autobiography of Malcolm X. He says that after the split with Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm was drawn off into a tragic diversion, a pilgrimage to Mecca to prove that he, not Elijah Muhammad, was the real Muslim. Oh, that's some nonsense. I'm sorry. I'm angry as I'm reading this. I'm angry at the slander. This had no relevance to the streets of Harlem, end quote. But it did have enormous relevance to Malcolm and the small group of ex-Black Muslims who had joined him in the effort to build a new movement. It was a stage in his development that would have been extremely difficult to skip over. In one sense, a religious settling of accounts, but in another, a differentiation that cleared the ground for other things. The other things included politics, the colonial revolution, and the relation of the American Negro to the world revolution. Nelson mentions the trip to Mecca, but he overlooks the fact that on both of his trips, Malcolm spent most of his time not in Mecca and among Muslim religious leaders, but in the newly independent African countries and among people with whom he could discuss politics. Later, Nelson says that in Malcolm's last months after his 2 trips, he had begun to renew himself and his regenerated purpose began to take form, a political form. His regenerated purpose began to take form, a political form. He was talking now like a member of the revolutionary majority. But how can this quote-unquote regenerated purpose be fully understood or accounted for without looking to its African sources? Malcolm's experience had made him skeptical about the Americans skeptical about Americans, including most of those who considered themselves radicals. Speaking to a mixed audience in New York on May 29, 1964, shortly after his first African tour, he said, "Nowadays, as our people begin to wake up, they're going to realize they've been talking about Negro revolt, Negro revolution. You can't talk that stuff to me unless you're really for one, and most of you aren't. When the deal goes down, you back out every time." Speaking to a similar audience on January 7, 1965, after his second African trip, he said that some changes would come when whites who were fed up learned how to establish the proper type of communication with blacks who were fed up. And then he added, "But how many sitting here right now feel that they could truly identify with a struggle that was designed to eliminate the basic causes that create the conditions that exist? Not very many. They can jive, but when it comes to identifying yourself with a struggle that is not endorsed by the power structure, that is not acceptable, where the ground rules are not laid down by the society in which you live and which you're struggling against. You can't identify with that. You step back. Oh, when things get bad enough, everybody gets into the act." And that's what's coming in 1965. In the same speech, Malcolm pointed to the deeply rooted cause for such unreliability, the powerfully conservatizing and corrupting influences exerted by the American economic and social atmosphere. You can cuss out colonialism, imperialism, and all other kinds of ism, but it's hard for you to cuss out that dollarism. When they drop those dollars on you, your soul goes. I'm so tempted to just let your soul go. In Africa, Malcolm had the opportunity to mingle with revolutionaries. That was a Soul Glow reference. In Africa, Malcolm had the opportunity to mingle with revolutionaries, both black and white. He was more receptive to their ideas and arguments than those of Americans he knew. He trusted and respected them more. He called the Algerian ambassador to Ghana, whom he met in May, a revolutionary in the true sense of the word, and has his credentials as such for having carried on a successful revolution against oppression in his country. The Algerian ambassador was white, but he had his credentials. Malcolm was much more ready and willing to learn from such men than from Americans who might talk radical talk, but from whom he did not expect much. When he returned late in May, the transition period ended approximately here. Malcolm no longer took the skull and crossbones label attitude to socialism. Volunteering to speak May 29th at the Militant Labor Forum, he brought up the subject of socialism himself when he said, and I beg your pardon, I'm just going to... They say travel broadens your scope, and recently I've had an opportunity to do a lot of it in the Middle East and Africa. While I was traveling, I noticed that most of the countries that have recently emerged into independence have turned away from the so-called capitalistic system in the direction of socialism. So out of curiosity, I can't resist the temptation to do a little investigating. Whenever that particular philosophy happens to be in existence or an attempt is being made to bring it into an existence. Later in that talk, he likened capitalism to the chicken. It's impossible for a chicken to produce a duck egg, even though they both belong to the same family of fowl. A chicken just doesn't have it within its system to produce a duck egg. It just can't do it. It can only produce according to what that particular system was constructed to produce. The system in this country cannot produce freedom for the Afro-American. It is impossible for this system, this economic system, this political system, this social system, this system, period. It's impossible for this system as it stands to produce freedom right now for the black man in this country. And if ever a chicken did produce a duck egg, I'm quite sure you would say it's certainly a revolutionary chicken. Oh, Malcolm. Oh my God, that's the end of the quote. And the question period after his talk, Malcolm was asked what political and economic system he wanted, and he answered, "I don't know, but I'm flexible. As we stated earlier, all of the countries that are emerging today from under the shackles of colonialism are turning towards socialism. I don't think that's an accident. Most of the countries that were colonial powers were capitalist countries, and the last bulwark of capitalism today is America. It's impossible for a white person to believe in capitalism and not believe in racism. You can't have capitalism without racism. And if you find one and you happen to get that person into a conversation and they have a philosophy that makes you sure they don't have this racism in their outlook, usually they're socialist or their political philosophy is socialism." End quote. Another speaker at this May 29 meeting was Clifton DeBerry, the Socialist Workers' Party's presidential candidate in 1964. In the discussion period, Malcolm praised DeBerry's formulation of the need for a combination of firmness in the principle with flexibility in tactics. A few weeks later, in a private discussion with DeBerry, Malcolm said that he sympathized with DeBerry's candidacy and that, of course, he was not going to support either the Democrats or the Republicans in the election. For various reasons, however, he felt that he could not openly endorse DeBerry. What he could do, he said, was to open some doors for DeBerry in Harlem so that he would get a better hearing for his program and greater circulation of his literature. Malcolm did make such arrangements before his second trip to Africa in July, and before leaving, he urged his closet co-workers to cooperate where possible with the Socialist Workers' Party campaign. Malcolm remained in Africa throughout the 1964 presidential campaign. His attitude to Johnson and Goldwater was expressed in the September 12 Saturday Evening Post excerpts from his autobiography. Johnson and Goldwater, as far as the American black man is considered, are both just about the same. It's just a question of Johnson, the fox, or Goldwater, the wolf. They will both eat him. On the way home, he stopped off in Paris, November 23rd, for a speech sponsored by Présence Africaine, where he took a crack at people who call themselves Marxists and claim to be enemies of the system, but who were on their hands and knees hoping and working for Johnson's election. His own anti-capitalist and pro-socialist convictions had become quite strong by this time. He felt the need to express them publicly, not only at socialist meetings, but to his own co-workers and supporters in the Organization of Afro-American Unity, most of whom were not socialists and some of whom were anti-socialist. 2 months after his final return from Africa, he spoke about this question to Harry Ring, a staff member of the Militant. Ring was then giving a series of news commentaries over station WBAI-FM and had invited Malcolm for an interview that was taped on January 25, 1965, and was broadcast 3 days later, Ring says. While we were waiting for the technical arrangements to be completed at the station, Malcolm expressed his views on some of the problems facing a leader in the mass movement, how to raise the consciousness and understanding of the members without presenting ideas that seemed so far in advance that they would not be acceptable to many in the movement, and how to avoid being labeled in such a way as to become isolated from the ranks. Malcolm felt it necessary for his people to consider socialist solutions to their problems, but as a leader of a movement, he said it was necessary to present this concept in a way that would be understandable to his people and would not isolate him from them. It is easy, he commented, for people who are isolated from the movement and who have none of the responsibilities of leadership to stand on the sidelines and make militant-sounding declarations. Now, this was a reference to an ultra-left publication, Spartacist, and that had just attacked him as a representative of the World Muslim League who had made his peace with the American power structure. Most often, he observed such people simply repeated dogma and were not seriously trying to advance in the struggle. So this footnote that was haunting me, that it was hard to read past it. This footnote says, I'm trying to get where the footnote. What are you referring to, footnote? Okay, fine. I read too far past where the footnote was. Anyhow, it says, this was a reference to the American Communist and Socialist parties on their side. They both remained as antagonistic to Malcolm after he left the Black Muslims as they did before. An example of the way Malcolm introduced the concept of socialism to his own followers in Harlem can be found in the speech he made at an OAAU rally at the Audubon Ballroom on December 20th, 1964, less than a month after his last return from Africa. The subject of his talk that night was Africa. But before getting to that, he said, Almost every one of the countries that has gotten independence has devised some kind of socialistic system, and that is no accident. This is another reason why I say that you and I here in America who are looking for a job, who are looking for better housing, looking for a better education, before you start trying to be incorporated or integrated or disintegrated into this capitalistic system, should look over there and find out what are the people who have gotten their freedom adopting to provide themselves with better housing and better education and better food and better clothing. None of them are adopting the capitalistic system because they realize they can't. You can't operate a capitalistic system unless you are vulturistic. You have to have someone else's blood to suck to be a capitalist. You show me a capitalist, I'll show you a bloodsucker. He cannot be anything but a bloodsucker if he's going to be a capitalist. He's got to get it from somewhere other than himself. And that's where he gets it, from somewhere or someone other than himself. There's one thing that Martin Luther King mentioned at the Armory the other night, which I thought was most significant. I hope he really understood what he was saying. He mentioned that while he was in some of those Scandinavian countries, he saw no poverty. There was no unemployment, no poverty. Everyone was getting education. Everyone had decent housing, decent whatever they needed to exist. But why did he mention those countries on his list as different? This is the richest country on earth, and there's poverty, there's bad housing, there's slums, there's inferior education, and this is the richest country on earth. Now, if those countries that are poor can come up with a solution to their problems so that there's no unemployment, then instead of you running downtown picketing City Hall, you should stop and find out what they do over there to solve their problems. This is why the man doesn't want you and me to look beyond Harlem or beyond the shores of America. As long as you don't know what's happening on the outside, you'll be all messed up dealing with this man on the inside. I mean, what they use to solve problems is not capitalism. What they are using to solve their problem in Africa and Asia is not capitalism. So what you and I should do is find out what they are using to get rid of poverty and all the other negative characteristics of a rundown society. That was the end of that diatribe by Malcolm. 11 days later, in a speech to the delegation of young civil rights activists from Macomb, Mississippi, who spent their 1964 Christmas vacation in New York City, in a trip sponsored by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, Malcolm used simple but unequivocal words about the need to become and stay radical. He says, thank you, Terry. You get freedom by letting your enemy know that you'll do anything to get your freedom, then you'll get it. When you get that kind of attitude, they'll label you as a crazy Negro, or they'll call you a crazy, and he says the hard ER. They don't say Negro, or they'll call you an extremist or a subversive or a seditious or a red or a radical. But when you stay radical long enough and get enough people to be like you, you'll get your freedom. By the start of 1965, criticisms and rumors about Malcolm were being circulated around Harlem by both his enemies and some of his friends who could not understand and were unhappy about the course he was following. Alex Haley and Marlene Nadeau refer to some of these rumors, but neither mentions the one that charged Malcolm with abandoning Black nationalism for Trotskyism, a label often applied to the militant in the Socialist Workers' Party. Malcolm continued at OAAU rallies to urge the audience to buy The Militant, right? That's a publication, and in opening his speech before the Militant Labor Forum on January 7, 1965. He noted that this was the third time that he had spoken under his auspices, saying, I always feel that it is an honor every time that they open the door for me to do so. I'll be right there. The Militant newspaper is one of the best in New York City. In fact, it is one of the best anywhere you go today. This is how Malcolm praised The Militant as a publication. But he also took the opportunity at his meeting when he was asked if he would run for mayor of New York under leftist sponsorship to state, I don't believe that groups should refer to themselves as leftist, rightist, or middleist. I think that they should just be whatever they are and don't let people put labels on them, and don't ever put them on yourself. Sometimes a label can kill you. Though he did not want a label, Malcolm was not at all hesitant about expressing his anti-capitalist position, as in his January 18th interview with a young socialist, he said, It is impossible for capitalism to survive primarily because the system of capitalism needs some blood to suck. Capitalism used to be like an eagle, but now it's more like a vulture. It used to be strong enough to go and suck anybody's blood, whether they were strong or not, but now it has become more cowardly like the vulture, and it can only suck the blood of the helpless. As the nations of the world free themselves and capitalism has less victims, less to suck, and it becomes weaker and weaker, it's only a matter of time, in my opinion, before it will collapse completely. End quote. Malcolm chuckled when he read his statement after it had been transcribed and submitted to him for any changes he might want to make before the publication. Noting that it was the first time he'd made such a statement for print, he told Jack Barnes, "This is the farthest I've ever gone. They will go wild over this." The next day, January 19th, Malcolm went to Toronto to tape a TV interview for the Pierre Berton Show. One of the Burton's questions gave him a chance to state his revised thinking on the nature of the coming world showdown. Earlier, for example, in his talk on the Black Revolution, he had stressed the likelihood of a global race war. Now, as he considered the question in light of his more recent thinking, he applied a different emphasis. And here's that emphasis. Where an ultimate clash between East and West is concerned, I think that an objective analysis of events that are taking place on this earth today points towards some type of ultimate showdown. You can call it a political showdown or even a showdown between the economic systems that exist on this earth, which almost boil down along racial lines. I do believe that there will be a clash between East and West. I believe that there will ultimately be a clash between the oppressed and those who do the oppressing. I believe that there will be a clash between those who want freedom and justice and equality for everyone and those who want to continue the systems of exploitation. I believe that there will be that kind of clash, but I don't think it will be based upon the color of skin as Elijah Muhammad had taught it. However, I do think that the European powers, which are the former colonial powers, if they're not able to readjust their thinking of superiority toward the darker-skinned people whom they have been made to think are inferior, then the lines can easily be drawn. They can easily be lumped into racial groups, and it will be a racial war. The same theme was repeated a month later in Malcolm's last formal talk given at Columbia University on February 18th, 3 days before his death. He said, "We are living in an era of revolution, and the revolt of the American Negro is part of the rebellion against the oppression and colonialism which has characterized this era. It is incorrect to classify the revolt of the Negro as simply a racial conflict against Black and white, or as a purely American problem. Rather, we are today seeing a global rebellion of the oppressed against the oppressor, the exploited against the exploiter." End quote. Truman Nelson calls Malcolm a man struck down on his way to becoming a revolutionary and a liberator of his people. The material in this chapter indicates that it would be more correct to call him a revolutionary internationalist on the way to becoming a liberator of his people. That is why the American ruling class, the press, and the Negro leadership did what they could to prevent him from turning the corner. That is probably also why he was struck down. I want to thank the people who are here, starting with Tree TV Radio, Darren, Marion, Terry, I appreciate you for respecting my content so much, and the Sweet Mahogany Roots. I've decided to do what I care about on this channel. It's caused me some problems. It has relegated me to a sector wherein I am blackballed. But I care about what I'm saying on this channel, and I'm going to continue in that direction. I do have a backup channel that I asked you to subscribe to that I'm sure will do much better because it's not inside of this algorithm. And that channel is just my legal name, Chocolate Angel, and it has the very same Uppity Unicorn banner because the Uppity Unicorn banner has my birth name in it. So I know that there's no panel argument, there's no dragging, there's no life-threatening doxing and whatever else. So like what's going on in so much of the rest of this particular Black YouTube sector. and the various sectors that are offshoots of it. So I thank you for tuning in to content that is inspirational, tuning into content that is true, tuning into content that is respectful and tasteful. Malcolm X deserves this from us. If you never do anything in his name, if you never lift a finger or a foot towards any of his teachings, he deserves that we read his books, that we sit under the sound of his words and respect him as a person who gave his life purely and solely and utterly for our cause, dying as a true martyr in his integrity. We owe him that. The blood was spilt. The blood was spilt. So I get that this isn't the most exciting thing. Camera closed, no boobs, right? No panel, no arguments, no drama, no black woman bashing or black male hating. But you're still here. In spite of the simplicity and the purity of the message. And I thank you for that. I thank you for that. I'm uppity in a corner, I'm out of here.